For the 14th century poet Francesco Petrarch, Venice was the one true home of liberty. And he had good reason to say this. This is exactly how Venetians liked to think of themselves throughout the Renaissance. By Petrarch's time, they'd already developed a rich mythology of their history and origins, which made freedom the hallmark of their identity. Unlike every other republic in the Italian peninsula, the story went, Venice had been born in freedom. Reputedly founded by refugees on the 25th of March, 421, it had resisted every foreign invader, and despite much evidence to the contrary, maintained that it had never recognized the superior. Whenever the Doge appeared on public occasions, he was followed by the umbrella and sword, which had been gifted by the Pope as a sign of the city's equal status at a meeting with the Holy Roman Emperor in 1177. And that wasn't all. As Venetians were fond of pointing out to anybody who would listen, they had never succumbed to a domestic tyrant either. They'd always governed themselves in peace. The mercantile elites who dominated government were kept in check by a complex, extremely complex system of balloting, and though most people were excluded from the political process, Venetians liked to boast that there had never been any hint of popular unrest, let alone revolution. As this personification of Venice on the west facade of the Doge's palace proclaimed, the city, strong and just, had put the furies of the sea, civil discord and foreign oppression, beneath its feet, and it had grown rich and powerful in the process. Now, nobody denied that this liberty was owed in part to the sea. As the diarist Marino Sanudo pointed out, the rippling waves of the lagoon had protected the city more surely than any walls and had forced its people to work together. But for Venetians, this freedom was better understood in mystical terms, as a kind of gift from God. That Venice had been founded on the Feast of the Assumption, was taken as a sign that it lived under the Virgin Mary's protection, while the fact that St. Mark's remains had been pinched from Alexandria, apparently in fulfillment of a prophecy, was routinely trumpeted as both an emblem and a guarantee of the city's liberty, and he is often represented as a lion. Well, that was the myth, at any rate. But in reality, Venice's liberty was remarkably fragile. However perfect the Venetians liked to think their system of government was, however safe the lagoon may have felt, Venice was unable to eliminate the ambitions of unscrupulous men or avoid the envious eyes of its neighbours. Only a few years before Petrarch wrote the letter with which I began, Doge Marino Faliero had been executed after a botched plot to set himself up as an hereditary monarch. And less than a decade later, Venice came within a whisker of being conquered by its rivals. And this was just the beginning. As time wore on and the more prosperous Venice grew, the more acute the threats to Venice's freedom became. By the outbreak of the Italian Wars in 1494, Venice's neighbours, alarmed by the growth of its territorial empire on the Italian mainland, were openly talking about cutting it down to size. According to Machiavelli, in fact, Italy would never know peace until Venice had been destroyed. He was very subtle on that occasion. In 1508, the League of Cambrai was formed explicitly to deprive Venice of its liberty, and in 1509 things had reached such a pass that cannon fire could be heard from St. Mark's Square. Yet Venice was really very ill prepared to defend itself. As Sallust said of Rome, wealth had corrupted it, or at least made it complacent. Its patricians, jealous of their riches, were unwilling to take risks. Factions began to form, and the common people were growing restive. More than once, there was talk of revolution. And as the Italian wars rumbled on, the danger only seemed to grow more severe. It's no coincidence that in Sebastiano del Piombo's Death of Adonis, painted shortly after Venice was crushed at the Battle of Agnadello, a dark cloud is shown hanging over the city in the background. Nor is it a coincidence that in Giorgione's very mysterious painting The Tempest, we feel this sense of a nameless, dread hanging over the city again. So Venice was faced with a question that has tormented states throughout history. How should it protect or sustain its liberty? Upon what did its freedom depend, and how, in times of crisis, were its foundations to be reinforced? Now, clearly, Venetians couldn't stop their neighbours from attacking them, or at least not without making some fairly unacceptable concessions. So the answer had to lie with the Venetians themselves. But how do you unite a people against their external enemies? How can you stop them splintering apart into factions that can be preyed upon by would-be tyrants? As in many other Italian states of the day, Venice's patrician elite looked for inspiration to the Latin and slightly later the Greek classics. From works like Cicero's De Officiis, they derived the view that liberty, along with domestic peace, rested above all on two things: equity and the common good. Now, the reason for this was fairly obvious. Since all citizens in a free, self-governing city should live on a more or less equal footing with one another, equity was needed to ensure that everyone received the same treatment before the law, and that wrongdoers would always be punished irrespective of their wealth or status. And similarly, since a kingdom divided against itself cannot a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, it was also necessary for all citizens to put the common good far above any private interest. You have to think that working together is more important than getting the best deal for yourself. So if Venice was to remain free, it needed to strengthen both equity and this commitment to the common good. But how? How do you do that? From the mid-13th century, most Italians, influenced by their reading of the Latin classics, had argued that the key was to make people good, to cultivate certain virtues amongst the citizenry. Now, what these virtues were depended on who you asked. Some thought there were 7 of them. The 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude or magnanimity, and 3 theological ones: faith, hope, and charity. But others preferred a smaller number or invented their own. It was fairly varied. But that liberty depended on making rulers and citizens good remained an absolute commonplace of political thought until the Machiavellian revolution of the 16th century. A great many letters, speeches, and treatises were dedicated to the question of how you make men virtuous. In Convenevole de Pratos, Regia Carmina, for example, a book that was dedicated to King Robert of Naples in the 14th century, a personified Rome said that she will only be saved from ruin if virtue was embraced, and begs the king to be a good chap in the face of all kinds of temptations. But making men good, making citizens good, was also a task for art. Art had long been a favoured tool for articulating political ideas in cities and states throughout Italy, and public and private commissions were widely believed to play a valuable role in bolstering the foundations of liberty. Not only could they be seen by a broad viewership, but they also had the potential to articulate our abstract ideas in a comprehensible fashion, and they could serve, if well placed, as something that everyone could reflect on a regular basis. Whatever virtues you happen to associate with equity and the common good, it was thought that the visual arts could help nurture them, either by associating them with existing institutions, thus legitimating current forms of government and building a bond with those institutions, or by providing viewers with something praiseworthy to emulate. A good example is provided by Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of Good Government, and strange enough, today is the day of the anniversary of Lorenzetti's death. Painted between 1337 and 1340, when, as Dante said, the towns of Italy were full of tyrants, this cycle of frescoes adorns the Sala dei Nove in Siena's Palazzo Pubblico, where the commune's highest council met to hear petitions. Here on the right, the bearded, imposing figure representing the city and commune of Siena is surrounded by 6 female figures personifying the virtues of peace, fortitude, prudence, magnanimity, temperance, and justice. And hovering above, there's also the figures of hope and faith as well. On the left, meanwhile, another personification of justice, this time a form of kind of deliberative judgment, raises her eyes to wisdom up above as 2 cords descending from her scales are tied together by concord down above the archway there. Meanwhile, down below, a procession of citizens bound together by those same cords unite in serving the common good, creating the impression of this beautifully harmonious and peaceful polity. Venice was no stranger to this tradition either. The ceremonial entrance to the Doge's palace, known as the Porta della Carta, articulated pretty much the same constellation of ideas, albeit in a slightly abbreviated form. Above the portal, visitors saw a pretty much life-size statue of the current Doge kneeling before the line of St. Mark. On either side of him, 4 statues represent the virtues of temperance, charity, prudence, and fortune, upon which the Doge's office and the Republic were founded. And as we look upwards, we can see the results of this. In the roundel at the top, St. Mark looks benignly outwards at the city, showering his favour and protection on the town. And at the top, the female figure of Justice is enthroned, resting her arms on 2 lions, as one does. Now, this all looks pretty impressive. And as in other parts of Italy, it formed an important part of public discourse. But for Venetians, it was clearly only half the story. While no one denied that the virtues were a laudable ideal, they remained just that, an ideal. And the pragmatic Venetians, that was always a little bit suspect. As Machiavelli famously pointed out, man was by nature a craven beast, as readily inclined to the bad as to the good. No matter how compelling your argument or how fabulous your art, you couldn't count on making people magnanimous, prudent, just, or whatever, especially in times of crisis. And as a Venetian called Paolo Peruta claimed, once your liberty had started to crumble, the little liberty you'd got left over was going to do you no good at all. So you're stumped. By the end of the 15th century, as the threats to Venice's freedom grow more intense, the Venetians realised that something else was needed, and the scope of Venetian art began to widen. Rather than focusing merely on the virtues which individuals should cultivate, artwork started to provide people with that guiding sense of identity which many of the speakers in the first session started to address. Emphasis fell on crafting an image of Venice as the embodiment of equity and the common good, on giving Venetians a reason to identify themselves with the whole, and on valorizing the Republic as it currently was. 3 visual components were stressed above all. The first was order. Take this wonderful piece by Jacopo de Barbari. This enormous woodcut, printed in 6 chunks, each more than 1 metre wide, was designed expressly to benefit this supreme city of Venice. The first version was so detailed that many scholars have been led to believe that it was actually based on a ground survey. Probably wasn't. But it was as much an idealised depiction of the city as a literal representation. The confusing warren of alleyways were simplified, towers were exaggerated, and public buildings like the Doge's Palace were made to seem more imposing than they really were. This made Venice seem not only more comprehensible, but also more orderly and rational. This was not a divine order, but this was the practical, everyday order which you need for everyday social life. But that it delivered divine benefits was clear. At the top, Mercury, and at the bottom, Neptune shower their favours on Venice as well. The second component was harmony. Clearly connected with order, this was about more than just the absence of conflict. It was also about ensuring everyone had a role and that no one outshone everybody else. This is vividly illustrated in Gentile Bellini's procession in St. Mark's Square, painted just after the Italian wars had broken out. There's a deliberate sprezzatura to this. We could think that we've just stumbled on a snapshot of real life, but actually this whole procession is very, very carefully choreographed. The whole polity is there, from the humblest layman to the most exalted elected official. Yet no one stands out above the others, even the Doge. Were it not for his golden mantle and umbrella, we might not even pick him out that easily at all. Each person has their proper station, each their own dignity, and each is as valuable and necessary as the rest. And to the painting's intended viewers, common citizens or, such harmony was no doubt a source of satisfaction, even pride. The final component was permanence, or rather immortality. Although we all have a natural tendency to think of polities and officials on a very human scale, care was taken to stress that both Venice and its institutions were both greater and more durable than any person. Even the most exalted magistrates were mere custodians whose powers and prerogatives would far outlive their mortal span. We can see this in Titian's portrait of Doge Andrea Gritti. It brilliantly captures the forcefulness of this man's character, yet it's overshadowed by the abstract authority of his role. Gritti's robes, glistening with rich brocade, are heavy and imposing. His stance is monumental, and his frame fills the canvas. The greatness of the man is apparent, but the greatness of his role even more so. Now, this was myth-making, of course, just like the idea of Venice as the home of liberty. And even contemporaries knew that it was a myth. But the advantages were palpable. Rather than trying to change human nature, to make bad men good, as it were, this image of Venice provided a model of society into which the efforts of even the most imperfect citizen, I'm coming to the end, don't worry, the most imperfect citizen could be subsumed, in which all had a defined place and in whose benefits all could share. It idealized the curtailment or the subordination of private interests.
If you stop here, you will make an immemorable impression. If you go on, everyone will forget everything that you said before. So you just decide.
I have two more sentences, three. Thank you very much. It idealized the curtailment of private interests while still allowing for the pursuit of ambition. It celebrated individual merit while reinforcing supremacy of the whole. And it placed all beneath the abstract authority of the state. As such, it allowed people to identify with the ideals of equity and the common good without making any demands of them. It celebrated the here and now, and in doing so, made liberty appear not so much a remote and perfect end, as a tangible, immediate way of living for flawed human beings. And that, I think, is surely an end to which we can all aspire. Thank you.
Wait a minute. Wait. One reflection. Was the idea of liberty in Venice just self-interest in disguise? You did what served independence and richness, and
well, what is the?
Or did they really believe in this? The crucial question: did they believe in this kind of liberty for other states in Italy?
No.
No. So
I don't think it actually would have occurred to them. Also, don't forget that they have, since the 1330s, been extending their sway over different chunks of northern Italy as well. So they're quite happy to protect and extend their own freedom in the sense of self-government and freedom from external domination. But they don't really give two hoots about whether other people have that or not. Oh. And I don't think it would have occurred to anybody until, in Italy at least, until the early 17th century, that in actual fact the peace of the Italian order is best served by assuring the liberty or the interlocking liberty of separate states.
Personal question: if you had to choose between living in this Venice and the Florence of the Medicis, which city would you choose?
Oh, Venice.
Venice.
No question.
Thank you.